Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and today let's talk about Anthony Trollope. So Anthony Trollope was a Victorian novelist. He was born in 1815 and died in 1882. And he is one of my absolute favourite Victorian novelists. It basically goes Dickens, Gaskell, Trollope. Pretty close to Gaskell. He is absolutely wonderful and there are so many things I love about him, so I thought I would make a video on him. I've read 10 books by him, one of which is a short story collection, 9 of which were novels. That's 9 novels out of the 47 novels which he wrote. He was very prolific and I would like to read everything by him, but it's gonna take a while. I am hoping that later on in the year, probably in April, around the time of his birthday, I will be doing a Barchester week where I will talk about his Barchester Chronicles, 1 book a day for 6 days of a week, because I love that series a lot and I want to talk about them in a bit more depth. But I thought, because I've also read some other books by him which I adore, and because there are so many things I adore about him as an author in general, that I would make a Let's Talk About Anthony Trollope video first. So first I want to go through 7 reasons why I love Anthony Trollope and why you should read him, and then I will talk quickly about the 10 books by him that I have read. So, number 1 reason why I love Anthony Trollope and why you might like him too is that I find his writing very easy and accessible for Victorian literature, and I find his books fairly quick to read. Some of them are quite long, but I never find them heavy. He's one of those Victorian writers that I think is, in general, not that difficult to read or to understand. Quite a lot of people start with his first Barchester novel, which is The Warden, which I think is not always the right place to start. I love it, but I think it is one of the driest of his novels, though really, really interesting. But in general, his writing is really smooth, it's really easy to follow. He has a lot of dialogue, and his dialogue is often really enjoyable, quite like short sentences and really funny. His writing is elegant and beautiful, but also kind of precise and simple and great. Another reason why I love him is that he's very, very witty, and he has quite like a wry wit. It's less slapstick and laugh out loud funny than Dickens, but it's a bit more subtle, and he often pokes fun at things in a really, really enjoyable way. Let me read you a little short bit from The Way We Live Now that really made me giggle. Mr. Longstaff was intensely proud of his position in life, thinking himself to be immeasurably superior to all those who earned their bread. There were no doubt gentlemen of different degrees, but the English gentleman of gentlemen was he who had land and family title deeds and an old family place and family portraits and family embarrassments and a family absence of any useful employment. Anthony Trollope takes great pleasure in poking fun at the absurdities in society, and he also takes pleasure sometimes in disliking his dislikable characters and telling you that he dislikes his dislikable characters. He also slags off various Victorian figures. He was a staunch liberal and really disliked Disraeli, so there are quite a lot of snide remarks about Disraeli in The Way We Live Now, and he also had a little kind of ongoing jokey battle with Dickens, because Anthony Trollope is much more of a realist than Dickens, and there's a bit in The Warden where Anthony Trollope makes a big joke about a particular situation and what Dickens would do if Dickens was writing about this situation and what Anthony Trollope is going to do instead, and it really makes me giggle. He has really, really fun, enjoyable, funny writing. The third thing I love about Anthony Trollope is his unconventional plots. As someone who reads quite a lot of Victorian literature, I sometimes go into a Victorian novel, read the first half, and kind of know roughly what's going to go down in the second half. And one of the things I love about Anthony Trollope is that his books are not like that, and many of them keep you on your seat really, really guessing, with endings that break Victorian conventions and beginnings that are different to what you would expect. I love his novel He Knew He Was Right, which doesn't end in a marriage like many, many Victorian novels do, but begins with a marriage and follows the sort of fallout and dysfunctionality of this marriage when the husband starts to believe that his wife is having an affair. So many Victorian books are about courtship, and this is a book about marriage in such a complicated and interesting way. I also love The Small House at Allington, which is one of my favourite books by him, because the ending is so utterly wonderful, and because there are so many things about this book that like break so many conventions, and it's just awesome. It is also one of the reasons why I do have to say that Dr. Thorne is one of my least favourite books by Anthony Trollope, although Dr. Thorne, the 3rd book in the Barchester Chronicles, seems to be most people's favourite Anthony Trollope book, but for me it's much more conventional than the rest of his books, and I think that's a shame. However, despite the fact that I think the overall plot in Dr. Thorne is a little bit more conventional, there are still unconventional things in it, such as the fact that he has in it a character who is a baronet who started off as a working class man, has built himself up, and also is an alcoholic. Like, so many things that you don't tend to find in a Victorian novel. His books are very different to a lot of other Victorian novels, and that's something I really, really enjoy. Which leads me on fairly nicely, I think, to my number 4, which is his themes. He has so many fascinating themes that he deals with in his work. Church politics and the sort of divisions between high and low church, and the position of clergymen within society is a really, really important theme in the Barchester Chronicles. And one thing that the Barchester Chronicles deals with really interestingly is morality and clergymen, and if you are a clergyman, if you are a vicar, do you have a right to be more moral than other people, and should you be expected to be more moral than other people? Such fascinating discussions of morality turn up in so many of his books. He Was Right is also a book about marriage and trust and morality. The Way We Live Now is a book about money and power and class and politics and modernisation and what it means to be Victorian. His books are very, very, very current for the time they were written, not in that they're not interesting and fascinating and accessible now, but in that they deal so much with issues that fascinated the Victorians. His books are often wonderful, beautiful love stories, but he also uses these love stories to explore important and interesting themes of class, of gender, of respectability versus wealth, of the powers and dangers of money, about capitalism, about kindness, about old-fashioned values versus newer values. Like, there are so many wonderful, fascinating things going on in his books, and yeah, they're wonderful. They're very, very wonderful. Number 5, I want to talk about his realism and his characterisation in general. Although I love Dickens for the fact that he's not a realist, and for the fact that his books are absurd and mad, and a lot of his characters are exaggerated and put to extremes, although that is something I adore in Dickens, I also really like the reverse, and one thing I quite like about Anthony Trollope, and one of the reasons why I find him quite an interesting writer to compare to Dickens, is because he is not that. His characters are not exaggerated. He tries to write about situations that could happen, and he tries to make his characters very, very realistic. I really, really love the realism of his works, and I suppose it's something I enjoy in Elizabeth Gaskell as well. While I love the Victorian absurd writers like Dickens, I also think that the Victorian realists have a lot of really interesting things to say about the world, and I find the realism of Anthony Trollope's books to make them so emotionally engaging. And his characters, I would say, are thoroughly realistic, and one of the ways in which they're thoroughly realistic is a lot of them are flawed. There are a lot of nasty people in his books, there are a lot of people you don't like, but even the characters you don't like have a side that you can sympathise with and have difficulties that you can understand. For example, Mrs. Proudie in the Bar Searcher Chronicles is, on the surface, not a very nice woman, but also she is presented at times very sympathetically, and you do understand that as this incredibly intelligent woman in a society where she can't really do much with her intelligence, no wonder she rules over her husband, because she thinks she could do his job better than him. Or Georgiana Longstaff in The Way We Live Now, who declares that she will marry the first man who comes along with £5,000. She is mercenary and she is shallow, but the reason why she says she will marry the first man who comes along is because she is 29 years old, she's been out in society for 10 years, she finds her family difficult to live with, and she dreads the prospect of a life where she never gets to have a house of her own, when she never gets to be a wife and have all the opportunities that for a Victorian woman comes with that. Like, his characters, even when you are frustrated with them, are very understandable and feel very, very real, and that's one of the things that is amazing about his books. Number 6, I want to talk about his authorial voice. There's something about Anthony Trollope's voice and the way he writes his books, and the way every now and then he intrudes on the narrative to tell you what he thinks of his characters, and also sometimes just to give you a hint about what's happening in the end, just so you're reassured if you were really worried about anything particular that might happen. I find it really, really endearing, and I find it really enjoyable, and it makes me really trust him as a writer and feel very happy with the way his plot's going to go. And I do trust him. I think he is one of those writers that I have no gripes with, and that I never have anything to criticise in his books. I know I said that Dr. Thorne is a bit conventional for me, for example, but I think it's still a really great book, and I'm not sure there is another choice in that story that would have made it better. But like, Anthony Trollope is one of those writers where he never seems to make choices that I disagree with, unlike Dickens, who I love so much, and there are so many things I adore about Dickens's books, and I also slightly love being angry at Dickens sometimes when he does things in his books that frustrate me, but Anthony Trollope never seems to do anything that frustrates me. Whenever I expect him to do something that's going to frustrate me and to take the plot in the wrong direction, he just like pulls it all back into the right way that I wanted it to be, and it's amazing, and it's great, and it's great. And the final thing I want to talk about, which leads on fairly nicely, I suppose, from comparing him to Dickens, is that I find Anthony Trollope in general not as problematic as a lot of Victorian authors, which is always nice. Obviously I love Victorian literature a lot, and also because I'm very, very interested in the time period, I'm also fairly aware of different social and moral views which lead to various things in books, and I know that in many cases they thought quite differently to us, but despite that, it can still be hard and difficult when you're reading Victorian books and you encounter sexism and racism and so many other things, some of which are kind of worse than the general mood at the time, and some of which are kind of just along with the general mood at the time. But Anthony Trollope in general is an author who I find fairly enlightened in many ways, and like, I don't think I've ever encountered anything sexist in the Anthony Trollope books that I've read, and although there are characters who are quite racist in general. Anthony Trollope is critical of those characters. For example, in The Way We Live Now, there are quite a lot of characters who are quite anti-Semitic towards a few other characters, and Anthony Trollope is critical of anti-Semitism and critical of parents favouring their sons over their daughters, and critical of the Anglican Church looking down on the Catholic Church, and so many things like that, which are very, very interesting and always quite nice to encounter in a Victorian novelist. So there we go, those are 7 reasons why I love Anthony Trollope, and now let's talk about the books by him that I've read. So I'm going to start off by talking about Christmas at Thompson Hall. This is a short story collection, so I feel slightly different to the rest of them, and one that I really, really did enjoy. There are some lovely stories in here. A lot of them are maybe slightly more conventional than some of his novels. There's a lot of love stories, a lot of quite funny comic stories. The first one in this collection is very, very funny. I would definitely recommend this collection next Christmas probably, as it is quite Christmassy, but yeah, a really fun read. I also want to mention his novel Rachael Ray. This, it must be said, is a book that I haven't read for quite a long time. I really, really loved it at the time, but I read it when I was like maybe 16, 17, and I don't remember it that well. But I do remember that it's a really nice love story and that it's set around a brewery, which I found really interesting. At some point I will be rereading that, I think, and it's not a very long one. But in that sense, I think it's quite a good place to start because it's a bit shorter, it's a bit less intense thematically than some of the rest of his books, and it's more of a nice, quiet love story. Definitely one I'd recommend. Next, I want to talk about 2 books by him that I always kind of put together in my head. Mostly, I think, because they were the first 2 books by him that I read, and I can't actually remember which one I read first. And these are He Knew He Was Right and The Way We Live Now. He Knew He Was Right is a wonderful, wonderful book, and I'd really, really like to reread it actually, because I haven't read it again since I was a teenager, though I remember it a fair lot better than Rachael Ray, possibly with help from the television adaptation made on the BBC, which is excellent as well. He Knew He Was Right is a fascinating book. I know I mentioned it earlier, but it starts with a marriage, and then slowly you see the marriage fall apart as the husband begins to think that his wife is having an affair with an older man who is a friend of her father's. And their relationship in the book and their complete lack of communication and both of their pride and her anger at him and his anger at her is just so utterly good. It's so interesting in terms of examining Victorian marriage and in terms of examining sort of gender and where power falls in marriage. And as well as this main central plot line, there are so many other wonderful side characters who I love. I can't recommend it enough. It's an absolutely brilliant book. And then there is The Way We Live Now, which is, I'm gonna say, my favourite Anthony Trollope book, and a really wonderful book. This takes as its kind of central point the Melmottes, a family who turn up in London, a father, a mother and their daughter, and they have a lot of money, but no one knows really where they're from or where they got their money from, or if they even got it legally. They're not very respectable, they're a bit vulgar, but they have money, so everyone starts to visit them. And it follows the Melmottes and Mr. Melmotte's sort of fortune and his capitalist ventures, but also various characters who turn up around this fortune and end up involved with it, including the Carberry family. Lady Carberry, her son Sir Felix, and her daughter Henrietta. They have title, but they're very impoverished because Sir Felix is a terrible man and a drunken gambler, but he decides that he would quite like a lot of money, and so maybe he'll try and marry Mr. Melmotte's daughter, and things go on from there. A fascinating book in terms of its presentation of Victorian capitalism and money and sort of tradition versus modernity, or 1875 modernity, and morality and love versus duty, and so many wonderful things, and the ending is just, oh, it's great. It's so great. It's really great. And then the other 6 books by him I've read are all the part of the Bar Searcher Chronicles. The Bar Searcher Chronicles are wonderful because they're a series of 6 interconnected novels. Most of the books deal with new characters and new stories, but various characters crop up in other people's stories, and you'll spot characters who you've met in previous novels, and then like the final novel in the series kind of ties it all together and brings in so many characters that you've met before, and it's just wonderful. You do need to read them in order. I know a lot of people do ask me this, and I would say absolutely you do if you ever want to read them all. You can probably read most of the books individually and understand them, except for maybe the last and possibly Barchester Towers, but the rest you could all read individually and understand them, but they all like spoil the last book in some way, so I would highly recommend reading them in order. So we start off with this little book, The Warden, which looks at what happens when a man who's a warden of an almshouse suddenly has his calling and the money he gets for doing what he's doing called into question, and the will that left him this duty called into question. It's about morality and church politics and family life and responsibility, and it's really wonderful and definitely worth a read. A lot of people start the series with The Warden and don't love it because they find it a bit dry. I don't find it dry because I'm very interested in Victorian church politics, but if you're not, what I would say is that you should read The Warden quickly and then immediately afterwards pick up Barchester Towers, the next in the series, to get you properly into the series. Barchester Towers, I think, is a more accessible novel than The Warden, and an absolutely wonderful one, dealing fascinatingly and unconventionally with life in a small Victorian town. A lot of church politics again, but also love stories and stories about family. And I love that the main heroine in this is a woman in her late 20s with a baby, because that's an unconventional Victorian heroine, and that makes me very happy. Then we have Dr. Thorne, which I've already mentioned, which follows a young woman called Mary Thorne. She is in love with a man called Frank Gresham, who is fairly above her in society and who loves her too, but is told by his parents that he has to marry an heiress. Mary is not an heiress. She has no money, and she was also born out of wedlock, and she lives with her uncle, Dr. Thorne. And the book is partly about Mary and Frank's relationship and partly about Dr. Thorne and the difficulties he faces in his feelings of duty and morality, and also his deep love for his niece. And it's about class, and it's about money, and it's about so many other things. Like I said, it's not my favourite in the series because I find the plot a little bit more conventional, but I do think it's still a very, very enjoyable read. Next up is Family Parsonage, another wonderful book. This follows a young man, a parson called Mr. Roberts. He has a wife and a few young children, and he's a clergyman, and on the one hand he's happy with his life, and on the other hand he'd quite like to be involved in society more because society is shiny and nice and exciting, but he ends up involved kind of with the wrong people in society, and that is the main plot point in the book. And another plot going on in the book relates to his sister and her kind of relationship with a man who is a bit above her in society. And then the fifth book in the series, and my favourite in the series, and my second favourite Anthony Trollope book, is The Small House at Allington, which I adore. Like I said, I'm going to do a Barchester Chronicles week at some point later in the year and talk about these more in depth, but I love this book very much. It follows two sisters and their various romantic relationships and family dramas. It also follows kind of the four men around these sisters, including one called John Eames, who is like my favourite character, and Anthony Trollope, who is so very, very, very well drawn. It's brilliant. It's brilliant. It's so brilliant. And finally in the series is the last Chronicle of Bastet, which kind of brings everything together and features a lot of characters from the previous books. Its main plot focuses on a family we've met previously and what happens when a clergyman is accused of stealing a cheque, and how society reacts to it and how he reacts to it. Although John Eames is my favourite, Mr. Crawley is one of the best drawn characters in all of literature, and the way Anthony Trollope deals with his kind of mental health issues in some ways, his depression, but also with his kind of stoicism and the way he treats his life, and sometimes you're so frustrated with the way Mr. Crawley acts, but you also really understand him. It's a beautiful, brilliant, wonderful book, and I love how it deals with so many of the characters you've met previously. It met all my expectations and went beyond them, and it was just absolutely wonderful. So there we have it. That is my video on Anthony Trollope. I can't recommend him enough as an author. If you're looking for where to start with Anthony Trollope, I would say Rachael Ray is a nice one to start with, or also the Barchester Chronicles. But like I said, I highly recommend buying first both the Warden and Barchester Towers and reading them both back to back, because I think that will get you more into the world and the series, and those two do share a lot of characters and lead quite nicely into each other. I also think that He Knew Who Was Right and The Way We Live Now are excellent places to start, but they are also a bit longer, so you might not want to pick them up as your first one. That's it. Thank you very much for watching. Please let me know down in the comments if you've read Anthony Trollope and what you think of him, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.